Welcome to Talking Point from the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies.
Spirituality and Bereavement. Mary Carman Rose. A lecture given at Chichester on the 9th of September, 1996, at the 4th Ecumenical Conference on Christian Parapsychology. Dr. Rose is an emeritus professor of philosophy at Goucher College, Baltimore, Maryland, and a former editor of the Journal of Religion and Psychical Research. This article may reflect the language and attitudes of the time in which it was written. Responsibility for opinions expressed herein rests solely with the author, and such opinions must not be taken to represent those of the CFPSS. We offer it here as a talking point to spark your own thoughts and discussions. In this essay, I will try to show that there is a distinctive potentiality in traditional orthodox Christianity, which can provide for the Christian an intellectually and spiritually satisfying perspective on his experience with bereavement, which will lead to his finding the meaning and the truth for him of Jesus' promise. I am come that they may have life, and that they may have it more abundantly. John chapter 10 verse 10. Also, I will try to show that the development and defense of this view can provide important practical insight concerning parapsychology in general, Christian parapsychology in particular, and the roles of psychism in the Christian's spirituality and intellectuality. In my conclusion, I will present the rudiments of an epistemological hypothesis pertaining to the philosophical underpinning, the handmaid of virtually any inquiry whatsoever. Perspective and presuppositions. As an aid to articulating my views on Christian bereavement, I have developed the meaning of the term agapasm, which the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce gave to the philosophical community. As with all his neologisms, Peirce gave to agapasm a wealth of meaning which he used in his cosmology, philosophy of science, and illumination of cultural change. Here Peirce used agapasm to name supportiveness, and sometimes mutual supportiveness, among components of nature, and where man is concerned, he used agapasm to name an ideal quality of the desire to understand, commune with, and protect nature rather than dominate, exploit or merely observe it. Many Christian values are implicit in Peirce's concept of agapasm, and it is this aspect of agapasm which I wish to develop here. Among these values I include respect for others, kindness towards them, a willingness to foster their well-being, and a readiness to give of one's self for their sake. And I also include a desire to know and love the components of God's creation, as far as it is possible for the prepared human mind to do so, that is to know those real things upon which our opinion has no effect. The values which are inherent in agapasm I will call agapastic values. Any view of the moral and spiritual nature of man, which fosters these values, I will call an agapastic path. Of course, all the great world religions are agapastic paths, as are most of the great Western philosophical systems, for example the work of Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Moses Maimonides, and Spinoza. Of course, not all views of the human spirit provide agapastic paths. Thus, thoroughgoing skepticism, cynicism, hedonism, totalitarianism, tyranny, and, I suggest, Camus' secular existentialism, do not provide agapastic views. Among the agapastic paths, however, there are significant resemblances concerning spiritual and moral values, and in particular among those values trading to do with ideals in human relations. One thinks, for example, of the Eightfold Path of Buddhism, the Hindu law of karma, the Ten Commandments, and Jesus' first and second commandments. On the other hand, there are also at least two types of significant differences among the agapastic paths. First, there are differences among the ways in which they provide knowledge of the agapastic values. Thus, is Confucian respect to be shown to all humans or only to some? And again, which views teach that virtue is knowledge, and for which views is the individual free deliberately to do what he knows to be wrong? Secondly, the agapastic paths differ in respect to what each takes to be the most fundamental aspect of reality. For example, unlike Christianity, which is grounded in a revelation vouchsafed to us by the Creator, Zen Buddhism may be seen as grounded in nature, as it is known to the adult human of goodwill toward other humans and other sentient beings. And, though Taoism is rooted in a metaphysical agnosticism, its teaching consists largely of spiritual principles which, when understood and accepted existentially, shape the human spirit in accordance with some of the agapastic values. The meaning of psychism. Because of the multifaceted nature of God's ways with the bereaved individual, this topic must be introduced here. To introduce it, I need the concepts of real definition and extensive definition. What traditionally is known as real definition would require articulation of a meaning of psychism, which encompasses all, and only, instances of psychism. An extensive definition would identify psychism by means of a list of names of some types of psychic experiences. Because both the value and the mode of carrying on psychic studies are controversial, Psychism can at present be given a real definition only in a particular context. An attempt at real definition will be the product of the author's personal understanding of psychism. Thus, in reading about psychism, we need to ask what characteristics the author ascribes to the essence of psychism. Does he define psychism as a type of experience, in terms of its role or roles in spirituality and intellectuality, or in terms of its reference to reality? Here I will give an extensive definition of psychism, for example a foreknowledge of future events, a perception of the subjectivity of another person, or of an animal, or a quasi-sensory perception of the deceased in a non-sensory aspect of creation. Closely related to psychic experiences are additional highly diversified phenomena which the Christian may do well to interpret as adjuncts of psychism. They have a number of origins, for example intuition, mysticism, selected aspects of Eastern religion, imaginative, but perhaps insightful speculation on the basis of Christian beliefs, or personal experience of the goodness of God. Thus amongst adjuncts of psychism, I include extra-scientific and pre-critical topics such as tarot symbolism, the I Ching, synchronicity, the symbolic meaning of numbers, and so forth. Some of these merit serious attention because of the important part they play in the life of the individual Christian. I will not further explore them here except to say that some persons may want to interpret some of the adjuncts of psychism as compatible with Christian beliefs. In any case, it is fruitful to think of them as hypotheses which are open to assessment and possible clarification and development. And it also seems safe to say that, in part, their value can be assessed in terms of their effect on the spiritual and intellectual development of the individual who appropriates them. Epistemological issues. Modern Western science has always recognized the need for sensory data to serve as evidence in what Francis Bacon called the Novum Organum, the new method, and what others as late as the mid-19th century were calling the inductive method. As has often been pointed out, the result has been an opticizing of Western study of nature, while the obvious success and advantages of the new method continue to displace other modes of inquiry, notably rationalism, the appeal to intuition and mystical experience as sources of knowledge of reality, and faith as epistemological structure of acceptance of the revelations, which have created Western theisms. To this day, however, scientific inquiry has not fully overcome its exclusive reliance on sensory data so as to include the vast, centrally important, realm of human and animal subjective experiences as evidence not only useful, but also necessary in some of the areas in which there are attempts to use the methods of science. To be sure, in theology, philosophy, sociology, history, and psychology, inquiry into the subjectivity of humans has spontaneously, but also uncritically been given investigative roles through the inclusion of accounts of stories of personal experience. This situation obtains also in parapsychology, in which there is interest in accounts of psychic experiences. In all then areas, however, the inclusion of subjective experience in inquiry through the use of stories is informal, which in this context means that the stories are not epistemologically integrated into an understanding of the version of the method of science which is being used. What follows, I will not develop further the issues of investigation in parapsychology. Nor will I offer personal stories of psychic experiences. Rather, one will use what I know of such stories and what I believe about the truth of Christian doctrine as a basis for 8 principles pertaining to the Christian's experience of bereavement. These principles are intended as hypotheses rather than axioms or dogmas. The milieu of experience. Of course, Christians differ in their intellectuality and spirituality. I presuppose, however, that in respect to these there are also significant resemblances, in which I am interested here. In 2 steps, I will state the resemblances among Christians, with which I am mostly concerned. To be sure, today Christianity has been given a number of revisionist interpretations, each of which seems to meet the intellectual and spiritual needs of some persons. But traditional orthodox Christianity also continues to meet these needs for numerous persons. First, I will reassert some orthodox Christian views which are being put aside for revisionist theologies. The Christian has faith, or at least the seeds of faith, that the three-personed God has objective existence, for example, that God is not properly identified with the human unconscious, or with some of its working, that the name God is not properly interpreted as a symbol for a law, moral principle, or set of ideals. Arid that, though the three-personed God stands in multiple relations to creation, God is not to be identified with any aspect of creation. The Christian believes that God, the Father, is foundation to his life, while his life is centered in his faith that God sometimes gives him particular life experiences, and sometimes permits him to have particular experiences, and sometimes permits him to make a choice as to which experiences he will have. Secondly, I will stress some inherent aspects of Christian beliefs, which I suggest merit development at the present time. The Christian's commitment requires that he try to be obedient to Jesus' 2 great commandments, that he learns that faith and obedience are not static, but developmental, and hence will try to meet his life experiences with faith and charity so that they will help bring about his spiritual development and deepen his faith. Another resemblance among Christians is that they try to maintain their faith in Jesus' promise that your Father knoweth what things ye have need of, before ye ask him. Matthew 26:3. The Christian hope in the personal care promised by Jesus has epistemological significance. For it becomes the Christian's personal absolute, which subjectively he holds fast. There is an analogy between the vulnerability of the infant Jesus in the manger, in whom the concept of the absolute also pertains, and the vulnerability of the Christian, as he maintains his relation to God in hope and love. For his maintaining in his intellectuality and spirituality the existential roles of his hope and faith requires constant reaffirmation, which on some occasions comes easily, and on other occasions falters. Also, some Western thinkers, in borrowing from Eastern views of man and reality, revere a preference for spectacular features of Eastern metaphysics, as opposed to Jesus' teaching about children. Of such is the kingdom of God, Luke 18:16. Thus, in a recently published article, Francis K. Clooney of the Society of Jesus quotes from the Bhagavad Gita. As he looks into the mouth of Krishna, Arjuna realizes that to see the infinite God is to see too much, all at once. Seeing the many mouths and eyes of your great form, its many arms, thighs, feet, bellies, and fangs, the worlds tremble, and so do I. Such lines are intellectually exhilarating. But these metaphysical items cannot function as the center of Christian faith. Rather, the Christian emphasis is on the importance of the individual per se, whether he is in this life or the next, of his love for God and of God's love for him, and of his spiritual development, which God in his wisdom makes possible to him. Thus is it a desideratum that the Christian who experiences bereavement hopes for the deceased's spiritual growth. 8 Principles. Principle 1. All psychic experiences, which are compatible with the agapastic values, may be interpreted as being of God, whether they are given directly or indirectly. In Christian communities, there is sometimes ignorance of and prejudice against all psychism. Thus, the rationale for this principle is that Christians need an assertion about and defense of the view that psychism, and adjuncts of psychism, may be welcomed in Christian spirituality. There are at least 2 possibilities. First, perhaps some persons have inherent proclivities towards the having of psychic experiences, proclivities which their life experiences may have developed. Second, other persons may be given such experiences directly as gifts, either with or without developed capacities for psychic phenomena. But however the experiences may come, if, in having these experiences, the individual's thoughts are turned to the agapastic values, then it is likely that these experiences are gifts from God. And the truth of this conclusion becomes even more likely if the experiences bring him peace and spiritual leavening as he lives through bereavement, and if they increase his concern for the well-being of others, his hope for peace and joy in this life, and his faith that the deceased is learning to be happy and hopeful in his new life. One defense of this principle is the de facto widespread assent to psychism given by Christians who have had some first-hand experience with psychism. But there are also the very human tendencies to be impulsive and uncritical about interpreting experiences as having a psychic origin. Hence a principle concerning this is needed. Principle 2. Christians need to be aware of 2 kinds of experiences which might be mistaken for veridical Christian psychism. First, there are the experiences which are thought to be instances of psychism, but which very likely come from the individual's own nature and reveal only his personal fears, preferences, or wishes, and hence are not revelatory of an objective state of affairs. For Christian parapsychology and spirituality, the individual's mistaking a self-generated experience for a genuine psychic experience is a very important subject. Here, however, I will leave it, with the comment that these errors are not infrequent in the early days of the individual's having psychism as a component in his spirituality, that there are spiritual and intellectual dangers in remaining unaware of these errors, and that with sincerity in Christian commitment the tendencies to make these mistakes diminish. Or at least one learns to be critical in the situations where the mistake might occur. Secondly, closely related to psychism is mysticism, the study of which lies outside the scope of this paper. I mention mysticism here, however, because misconceptions of the significance for Christians of the source and/or content of mysticism and psychism are similar and are common occurrences. There are genuine psychic and mystical experiences that are not revelatory of a Christian perspective on creation, God, Christian bereavement, or Christian spiritual development. Thus, there is channeled material which may have its origin in a spiritual being who may be malevolent towards Christianity, indifferent to it, or ignorant of it. And certainly there is nature mysticism, and other forms of mystical experience in which, from the Christian perspective, what is discerned is some aspect of creation rather than the nature of the one God. Clearly, some current revisionist Christian theologies result from such psychic or mystical experiences. In any event, many persons have psychic or mystical experiences which do not pertain to the aspect of reality, viz., the one God, in which Christianity is grounded. And wherever there is diminishing of Christian teaching in its view of the goodness, power, and wisdom of God, there cannot be a fullness of a Christian view of bereavement. Principle 3. All Christians have spiritual, intellectual, and vocational needs for awareness concerning which some Christians, and in this context particularly the Bereavement 1 ed., are helped by God in many ways, including the warning of psychic experiences. The spirituality of some Christians may never include psychic events, and some Christians, who do not expect such experiences, may eventually come to know Christian psychism at first hand. Nonetheless, all Christians need to be aware of the beneficial roles psychic experiences have in the lives of the Christians to whom they are given, and of the effect these Christians have on others who through them are benefited too. The Christian who accepts the reality of God's use of psychic experiences for those who are bereaved is helped intellectually, because he can learn to be open to the great variety of God's involvements with us. He is helped spiritually, because he is reminded of the closeness of God to the bereaved. And he is helped in his personal ministry, because he can reassure those who have had such experiences of the legitimacy of psychism in their lives. The defense of this principle lies in part in the discouragement, and perhaps doubt, which overtakes the individual who finds that he has been helped by his psychic experiences, but who also finds that there are others to whom he cannot communicate this fact. Principle 4. For effective inquiry into the nature of parapsychology, and in particular into the parapsychology relevant to bereavement, major creativity, in dealing with the epistemological questions of such inquiry, is a necessity. A principle pertaining to the epistemological issues of parapsychology is a desideratum in this context. First, there is an investigative dialectic which arises between any area of inquiry and a particular method used to investigate it. Both scientific method and an area of nature, which is being investigated by some form of the scientific method, are illumined if we examine the dynamism of each and the relations between them. And the Christian may benefit from his psychic experience and from whatever usefulness he finds in selected adjuncts of psychism. But God has made us thinkers, and an interest in parapsychological method will augment the value of the psychism experienced by the Christian. There is a long-standing tendency to adapt one of the current well-established forms of the method of science to the study of psychism. There are at least 4 reasons, however, why our present understanding of the requirements for scientific inquiry do not suffice for investigation of the psychic experiences, which have a role in Christian understanding of bereavement. 1. Scientific inquiry is one type of what is sometimes called dialogic inquiry, that is, any one investigation, from its inception to its conclusion, its use in practical activities, and its assessment, is seen as requiring cooperative inquiry within a community of trained scientists who assess experientially derived hypotheses with the expectation that, if virtually all members of the community who are on rapport with that particular inquiry agree that the hypothesis has been verified, then that hypothesis may be accepted as reliable belief. 2. The scientific community is committed to admitting as presuppositions in their inquiry only conclusions resulting from past scientific inquiry, the adequacy of which has been established by their usefulness in technology or other applied science. 3. Of course, a corollary of this last point is that the religious and/or other metaphysical convictions of scientists are not to be allowed to shape their scientific investigations and preferences. 4. Beyond the scientist's integrity in reporting all available data relevant to his work, and his intention to be unbiased in his interpretations of his observations, the spiritual and moral characteristics of the scientist are irrelevant to his work. In part, this means that scientific inquiry is to be interpreted as morally and spiritually neutral. It may be used for virtually any purpose, whatever the cost to humans, animals, and the rest of nature, irrespective of the status of any beliefs which some persons may hold sacred. What of the epistemological structure of inquiry concerning psychism? Specifically, what of the Christian's personal reflection on his psychic experiences which have been helpful to him? What if this Christian is a parapsychologist? What of the general membership of the parapsychological community? There are 3 points to be made. 1. For the Christian, reflection on his psychic experiences is ideally fundamentally monological rather than dialogical. For crucial to his reflections are his interpretation of the time's content of his psychism, and his assessment of its spiritual and intellectual value to him. He alone has the power and, I suggest, the right to make these decisions. The ideal Christian view is that these experiences have been given to him for his benefit, and not primarily as a help to parapsychology. 2. What if the Christian is a parapsychologist? He will be implicitly at odds with some of his fellow parapsychologists. Perhaps he will have the interest, training, and creative gifts to work out a suitable epistemology for inquiry into the psychism that occurs in bereavement. But these endowments are rare. And if he does not possess these endowments, then his work is incomplete. At best, it will consist of conclusions without developed philosophical underpinnings. 3. What of the Christians presenting, for dialogic inquiry, his experiences which have supported and illumined him in bereavement? Since the meaning and value of these experiences are known only to the person to whom they are given, I think the Christian is wise who hesitates to submit these experiences, which he considers sacred, to those to whom, perhaps, nothing is sacred, or who at best have a non-Christian understanding of the sacred, or whose spirituality and religious commitments are very different from his. When they are revealed, these psychic experiences are often ridiculed, while the Christian, for his part, cannot treat them with the detachment required by science. And the usefulness of accounts of psychism to parapsychology is seriously diminished when researchers are incapable of understanding their value and content. But on the other hand, such a rejection of evidence concerning psychism can become for the Christian a challenge to work out a responsible creative development for the epistemology of parapsychology. At any rate, when these experiences come to his mind, the Christian will consider them lovingly and will reaffirm his love for the deceased, and the psychism, which has helped sustain him during bereavement. Principle 5. Through God's grace, the Christian has numerous helps during bereavement. The rationale for this principle is that every good and every perfect gift is from above, James 1:17, that these gifts help the specific needs of the individual, and that Christian communities are often unaware of the great diversity of gifts God bestows upon us. Thus, in accordance with the teaching of traditional Christianity, the individual legitimately believes that help is available from many sources, which support his desire to remain faithful to St. Paul's admonitions to sustain one's faith, hope, and charity, and to rejoice. Some persons have a presentiment of the death of someone close to them, and such an experience may give to the Christian, and perhaps for the rest of his life, a helpful and yes, the blessed conviction that this death is part of God's plan for the deceased, for the bereaved, and for their eternal relationship. This forewarning can take many forms. Besides the psychic experiences and their adjuncts, there are persons in this life who are able to bring support and comfort. In the non-sensory aspects of creation, there are humans and other spiritual beings who are able to help the bereaved and seem to have a vocation to do so. there are the love and attentiveness our companion animals give us. There is a providence of books we may read and courses that we may take, and there is the help that comes from the bereaved Christian's direct relation to God. Currently there are suggestions of predictable stages of spiritual and intellectual phases of bereavement, for example, shock, denial, bargaining, guilt, anger, depression, acceptance, and hope. To be sure, these stages may be helpful to some whose spirituality is grounded in a philosophical naturalism, that is, the view that the physical world is the whole of reality, that the human being literally is his body, and that there is no life after physical death. These stages, however, are not descriptive of Christian bereavement. The Christian need not accept the suggestion that he will go through this sequence of emotional states. Ideally, he knows he has an alternative, viz., he can call into action his capacity to make a free choice to cultivate hope and an expectation of future spiritual enlightenment. Of course, on the other hand, he may remain angry and depressed for a while, or he can cultivate a stoic resignation and await a stoic peace. But he may choose to sweep these out of his consciousness and fill his mind instead with love for God and gratitude for the revelation concerning the importance of maintaining hope for the peace the world cannot give. Principle 6, a corollary of Principle 5. We stress the importance of the bereaved Christians making the choice to maintain hope for his continuing spiritual development. We approach this topic through attention to the swings of mood the bereaved individual may experience, and to examine them from the perspective of St. Paul's. We know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose, for Romans 8:28. The bereaved person's enjoyment of times of high spirits may be taken to be a gift from God, and these times not infrequently follow upon the making of the free choice to replace thoughts of frustration and dullness with aspirations to achieve greater faith. But in bereavement, what of the seemingly inevitable periodical return of depression? We are often told by those who have learned from their personal experience that these conditions are also God's intention for us, that they have a specific purpose in our lives, and that we have divine help while we live through them. We can open ourselves to this help by using our free will to replace depression with gratitude for our knowledge of the generosity of God. Principle 7. The Christian concept of the communion of saints is a source of comfort, but also of enlightenment, particularly in bereavement. Some Christians are comforted and at peace concerning their dead, because they not only believe that the life of those they have loved continues after their death, but also that they are in communion with them. There are at least 6 possibilities. There may be indirect contact with the deceased through a medium, direct contact with the deceased, which can be visual, auditory, tactual, and/or olfactory, dreams relating to the present state of the deceased, channeling from a source which the bereaved person considers reliable, and direct mind-to-mind contact between the deceased and the bereaved. I suggest that, so interpreted, the communion of saints is a major concept which, if interest in it is not discouraged, might have a greater role in the spiritual life of Christians than it has at present. And once opened for renewed theological inquiry, it might become an extensive multifaceted subject. The following brief comments must suffice here. As I noted above, it may be appropriate to include among the adjuncts of psychism dreams, hypotheses concerning life after death, intuitions, and flashes of insight concerning the deceased. Through his monological inquiry, the individual may have reason to conclude that he has achieved some true insight concerning conditions under which the deceased person's spiritual development is proceeding. For example, what is the nature of the judgment? What choices of spiritual development are offered? How is that development accomplished? How is justice, interpreted as fairness, seen as related to justice interpreted in the important Platonic sense of possession of the right relation to reality, which is most fundamentally the right relation to the nature of God and to the human vocation of stewardship of nature. Also, we might learn of work that the deceased and the bereaved can do together, thus enriching both their lives. The fact that emphasis on the concept of the communion of saints will enrich the spirituality of the Christian who is bereaved follows from my stipulation that my reflection on the topic of this paper is grounded in the nature of a sustained commitment to traditional orthodox Christianity. Nonetheless, a word concerning some dangers in this emphasis is not out of place here. In the foregoing, I have had in mind only the psychism, which appears to have salutary effects on the bereaved. It is possible, however, that an individual may choose to find peace in psychism at the expense of his wholesome, loving relations with those in his present life. And some of us may wish to recall him to his opportunities for satisfying human relations here. Surely, wise judgment about this can be made only in the light of considerable knowledge of the individual in question. In general, however, there is no harm in asking such an individual whether he believes he is making the right choice in emphasizing his relation to the dead. On the other hand, certainly some time must pass before this question is raised, for it may be that important spiritual development is taking place during a period of intense involvement with one's dead. In any event, there is a dynamism in Christian faith which gradually brings freedom from spiritual bondage to the bereaved. Principle 8. Christians differ in respect to the importance of psychism in their faith, but ideally the love of God, which subsequently gives rise to love of neighbor, is central in the faith of all Christians. Given Jesus' first and greatest commandment, it is feasible to conclude that it is the Christian's love of God that is the raison d'etre of his holding fast to his commitment to Christian beliefs, to obedience to God, and hence gradually to learning from God what it means to love one's neighbor as oneself. Perhaps then psychic experiences are adjuncts of faith, and they may be important supportive elements in the faith of some Christians. Sustained aspiration to grow spiritually in terms of Christian values, appeal to the teaching of a Christian one admires, and remaining faithful to Christian teaching, because of great existential need are significant adjuncts too. But I suggest that the fullness of faith requires the love of God. Conclusion. I wish to point toward a possible discernment and eventual development of the roles of agapism in Christian thought, in all philosophical or religious thought, and in the philosophical underpinnings of any inquiry. I start with something we all could have learned from modern Western science, but also from our life experiences, viz., that we often neglect, or do not search for bits of evidence, reminders, or hunches which may be clues to new approaches to our search for truth. I suggest that any Christian who has philosophical interests and who has cultivated a Christian attitude towards bereavement has been in the position to glimpse possible opportunities for theological, spiritual, philosophical, and even scientific approaches to investigation. First, however, such a person must have an eagerness to discern new avenues for creativity, and to follow up suggestions as to hunches concerning sources of new insight, however outmoded at the present time these are judged to be. A first possibility to be glimpsed is that in any inquiry, an agapistic attitude is a beneficent, wholesome influence, and at times a necessary component in inquiry. Perhaps the cultivation of this attitude would make of us better observers, or perhaps our beneficence would enable the persons and the situation we observe to manifest qualities which our fear, indifference, or desire to dominate would forbid. And at this point there is need to test the hypothesis that the agapistic can become an aid in some investigations, or a necessity in others. But there is one component always present in an initial step of any monological inquiry. We may ask what of the history of human inquiry. Is there something related to this question, which we have put aside, but which we may need to reclaim? Examples of these are close at hand. I choose an example from the 13th century Saint Bonaventura's The Mind's Road to God. Therefore to the cry of prayer through Christ crucified. Do I first invite the reader, lest perchance he should believe that it suffices to read without unction, speculate without devotion, investigate without wonder, examine without exaltation, work without piety, know without love, understand without humility, see without wisdom divinely inspired. My suggestion here, then, is that new creativity in the development of inquiry is possible through giving the thinker's capacity to love a role in his work, just as it has a necessary role in his resolve to grow spiritually through his response to bereavement. His creative capacities may increase with his love for his area of inquiry, both for its own sake, but also because of its relation to the God who created it, his love of his investigative relation to it, and his love for what truth there is in his findings. One important point here is that just as in bereavement the Christian's love for the deceased, the Christian's emphasis on hope and eternal life, and his love of God helps him to sustain his Christian faith during bereavement, so it may be that the agapastic attitude maximizes the effectiveness of the individual's investigative capacities.
You have been listening to Talking Point from the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies. To find out more, please visit www.churchesfellowship.co.uk.